Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Bonnie M. Griffin is a postpartum doula who specializes in preparing her clients for their postpartum experience while they are still pregnant. Her individualized postpartum support is informed by her background and knowledge in social work, in herbalism, in breastfeeding, and in baby wearing. Bonnie has 2 children and enjoys reading, being in nature, and doing yoga. Bonnie's website is bonniemgriffin.com. Well, Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to be able to have a chance to talk to you. This is such an important topic that so many times people don't get a chance to address or even know there's a possibility to address. What does a doula engage in, and what's the postpartum process like? So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into what you're doing and what drives your passion for it?
Sure. So I have always worked with people. I have a master's degree in social work, and I've always loved, one-on-one person interaction. But when I got pregnant with my first child, I found out I heard about a doula for the first time. And I ended up hiring a birth doula, and that really went amazing. And I kind of fell in love with the work that they do. And after I had my second child, I decided to stay home. From that process, I was kind of itching to get back out there to work with people. So I decided to pursue doula training, and I trained as a full spectrum doula. But I've decided to have this little niche in postpartum and preparing for the postpartum, because I found that if you know what a doula is, you almost always assume that it's a birth doula. But there are other doulas out there, and postpartum is kind of like an afterthought in our culture. So we prepare for birth, spend all this time worrying about birth and how it's going to go. We, hire providers to help us with our birth, but then we find ourselves in the postpartum and are a little unprepared. And that was my experience. I did, years of research as I was trying to conceive, and I was so focused on birth and found myself in the postpartum, not really understanding how to navigate that.
I'd like to ask about, what are the misconceptions about what a doula is and does?
Sure. I like to start off by just talking about what postpartum actually is. In our culture, we talk a lot about, we say things like, I don't want to get postpartum, or she got postpartum. But what we really mean by that is postpartum depression. Postpartum is just the time period that is after you've given birth. So the fact that we associate depression with that time so much that we use the word postpartum to mean that is concerning. But just so that's a misconception of postpartum. When it comes to doula work, one of the big misconceptions is that all doulas attend births, or that is just the purpose is them to be there as just labor support. But even a birth doula will spend time with you in the pregnancy, and they do see you a little bit in the postpartum. And although they are helping you with birth, it's oftentimes you get a lot of emotional support as well from a doula. There's postpartum doulas, there's bereavement doulas, there's miscarriage doulas, there's fertility doulas, there's doulas out there for pretty much anything you can think of for any major life transition.
So how would you distinguish for people who aren't aware of the differences between a midwife and a doula?
Yeah, so a midwife is a medical professional that provides medical care, and that could be inside a hospital setting, so a midwife that works within a hospital, or that could be a home birth midwife. A doula does not do any medical intervention, so we wouldn't be helping to deliver baby. We wouldn't be, listening for baby's heartbeat or anything like that. the doula really complements a medical professional, whether that's a midwife or an OB, and provides that emotional support that you don't always get, provides some extra education that you don't always get from your care provider, and can kind of get to know you one-on-one a little bit better. You can spend more time with your doula than you typically would with your care provider. The other big difference between a midwife and an OB is that midwives can do pretty much everything except for surgery. Midwives can also do, pap smears and things like that. The midwives are not specific just to birth either.
So I recently had somebody tell me that they were hoping that their midwife would help coach their husband so that the husband could be more involved in a useful way in that birth process. Is that one of the things that you, in the postpartum doula, do you incorporate the husband, the family, in
Totally. Yeah. So specifically me as a postpartum doula, I don't often attend births, but some, doulas will also attend births and focus on the postpartum. But no matter what transition we're supporting, the role is definitely to get the family involved. It is a misconception that doulas kind of take over the role of the partner and that the partner isn't needed then. But I'll say it was my husband who actually wanted a doula with our first child because he didn't want to feel like it was just up to him, right? So if I were attending a birth, I would be making sure that, the birthing person's needs are met. But I also kind of in my periphery am making sure that the partner's needs are met too, whether that's water, food, rest, or emotional support through that transition. And it's the same in the postpartum. So the birthing person and the baby are definitely the focus, but oftentimes at a postpartum doula meeting at my client's house, I'm interacting with everybody and assessing everybody's needs.
What period of time would you say as a postpartum doula, what's the range of time that you're engaged with someone when they retain your services?
Sure. My little niche is to focus on preparing for the postpartum and not just supporting in the postpartum. So I like to start working with a client in their pregnancy because just like we prepare for birth in the pregnancy, we can prepare for postpartum in the pregnancy. So I like to start working with people and developing a relationship in the pregnancy. And then really the length of time that I'm supporting somebody in the postpartum would really depend on their needs. I like to say that postpartum is forever because literally the definition is the time after birth. And if you've birthed a baby, you know that your body will be different for probably the rest of your life in certain ways. Granted, the medical professionals would say that your postpartum time is about 6 weeks because that's when your uterus returns to its normal size typically. And psychologically, to have a diagnosis that is related to the postpartum time, you have to be within a year of birth. But honestly, if you have a toddler around or if you're extended breastfeeding or you have multiple children even, you have sleep issues, you have breastfeeding issues, you have just, all of the things for much longer than even a year. But it really is about that individual family's needs. So I don't like to put a cap on it. And I like to do hourly services so that I can be utilized when needed.
So what are some of the primary issues that you find your clients struggle with most as in that time period after birth, in the postpartum period?
Sure. Well, immediately it's typically, that adjusting to attending to everybody's needs. So even if this is their first baby that they have birthed, that is a whole nother person that has needs to attend to in addition to their own and maybe a partner. If there's multiple other children, again, you're adding another person to the mix. So you kind of have this adjustment period where everybody's kind of figuring out how the dynamics are going to look in the family now that there's an additional person in the family. that often translates for the birthing person this identity crisis in a sense, especially if it's their first baby that they're adding to their family. It's a big life transition to go from somebody who doesn't have a child to now does. What that looks like for your identity, what you can and cannot do anymore, what you have time for, how you're going to prioritize your time, how that will affect your family dynamics with extended family, how that affects your friend dynamics, if that's going to affect your employment, things like that. But in addition to that, the other really big thing that I like to talk about that people don't always think about in the postpartum is the birthing person really oftentimes struggles with how to care for themselves. So everybody has these needs, and then you kind of lose yourself, and like your priority of yourself is lost. And I'm here to help remind you how to take care of yourself while taking care of others. And I'm looking out for the birthing person and caring for them while it's so hard for them to figure that out for themselves.
So self-care, adjusting to a new role, creating or letting your sense of identity morph into what it's going to be as a parent instead of a single person, balancing that care for others and care for self. You mentioned something about, the breastfeeding, some other issues. Name a couple of these others that might entice somebody to either start doing their own research or looking at the potential of engaging a doula's services.
Sure. So that education piece that doulas can provide, every doula kind of has, things that they specialize in. I've done some training and some breastfeeding support, so I am able to offer that breastfeeding or chest feeding support if that is something that the family is choosing. And baby wearing is another skill of mine that I like to really incorporate into my postpartum work. So baby wearing is a skill that you often need somebody to like tangibly help you with. It's harder to learn from a video, in my opinion. And especially right now in the pandemic, the baby wearing group in my county isn't meeting. So oftentimes I'm there to help parents learn how to actually wear their newborn and how that can help them to bond more, but also to feel more confident in their parenting. So, maybe if they have multiple children, wearing that baby when they've gotten to the point where they're physically able to do that so that they can then also play with their toddler with two hands can really make a difference. I'm also an herbalist, so that's another thing that I bring to the table. So in the pregnancy, I'm helping with herbs for really to support you hormonally and nutritionally. And we bring that over into the postpartum as well. So a lot of times that looks like herbal teas and herbal infusions, depending on, how often those are drank. I've seen, new parents just really gain some energy from that. Maybe it's a postpartum herbal bath to help with healing. There's lots of different ways we can incorporate herbalism as well. So my three little niches are breastfeeding, baby wearing, and herbalism, in addition to things like self-care.
Okay, so this other aspect that you mentioned, which is it's so prevalent and it's become part of the culture to just talk about postpartum and mean postpartum depression. So what would you share with us about postpartum depression as a phenomenon?
So postpartum depression obviously is definitely an issue that we deal with in this country, but we know that there's other countries that don't have as high as rates of that. And I would like to say that it's really interesting to take a look at how we support new parents when it comes to things like paid maternity and paternity leave, which doesn't really exist in our country, whereas other countries have, sometimes up to 2 years, both parents can be paid to stay home. Also, in our culture, we tend to really focus on baby, and we tend to focus on material things. So the way that we often celebrate somebody being pregnant is through a baby shower, where we focus on what that baby's gonna weigh like, what it's gonna look like, what color hair it's gonna have. We play all these guessing games around it. And then we buy cute little baby items. And parents end up with all of these baby clothes that newborns don't really need. And they end up with all of these gadgets and contraptions for their baby to sit in, whether that's a bouncy seat or whatever. I'm not saying that that is the wrong way to support parents. I'm saying that that can't be the only way we support parents. So if everybody that attended a baby shower could then pitch in, like actually tangibly or financially or something like that, to support that family after baby has actually came, and not just, purchase some cute little baby socks that don't really even work. They just fall off of baby's feet. And then they say, hey, can I stop over to see the baby? And then they're really, just want to hold baby, but they're not sweeping the floor, they're not bringing food, things like that. So that's the shift in the culture that I would really like to see, is that we kind of have to create that community and that, for lack of better terms, that village again around families that are adjusting to new parenthood. So they need a lot more than baby clothes and baby gear. They need somebody to bring them food. They need somebody to support them emotionally. They need somebody to just do the dishes, honestly, things that you physically can't do when you're healing and trying to take care of a newborn. So because we lack these things, like our government supporting us and people around us supporting us, I really believe that that affects our rates of postpartum depression. Because if you don't feel supported through a major milestone and transition in your life, it's very easy to feel sad, and it just kind of snowballs in a sense, because your hormones are really affected by your stress level and by your nutrition. So if you don't have somebody helping you to make sure you're eating and that you're not super stressed out, it does affect your hormone production, and that can affect postpartum depression. Especially right now in the pandemic, we are dealing with isolation with new parents. That is really scary. You're not meant to be alone with a new baby all day long. That's not ideal. So again, postpartum depression is totally a thing. Postpartum anxiety is totally a thing that is often not talked about. Postpartum psychosis, postpartum autoimmune disorders. These are definitely things, but it's really hard to say that it's hard to say how much of this would be seen if we actually supported new parents when they needed it the most.
So as a doula who specializes in postpartum, do you find yourself trying to help either construct or connect or activate the network around the new mother and father and kind of push or initiate some of that support?
Totally. As one of my freebies on my website, which is bonniemgriffin.com, I have a form that's called the Postpartum Education and Support Inquiry Form. And that is a form that kind of educates quickly family members or friends about how we don't do a great job in our culture supporting families after they've had a baby. Traditional cultures around the world all seem to have the same thing. They support that family for roughly 6 weeks, 40 days, to the point that a new parent, the birthing parent especially, is not required to do anything other than bond with their baby and to actually physically heal. So it kind of educates about that and how we lack in that a little bit. And then it also has a form where people can kind of sign up for activities that would support the parents, the new parents, that they feel comfortable doing. So a lot of times we hear people say, oh, let me know if you need any help or give me a call. But that's really vague. And in our culture, we feel weird about asking for help because then we think that makes us weak. But if somebody actually writes down on a piece of paper, on Thursdays, I can make sure your garbage is taken out, it's really easy for us to accept that help versus asking for something specifically. And then the people are offering help more because they can offer to do things that they feel comfortable doing. It can be really overwhelming to say, oh, let me know whatever you need, because maybe they need something I don't know how to give, right? So that is a form that I created that is great for baby showers to put on the table, or just to send in as an email or something like that. So that's kind of the work I'm doing a little bit in the beginning. Ideally, I would like to meet with like extended family members in the pregnancy to talk about these things as well. And then I'm also coaching the new parents on how to communicate their needs and to set up boundaries for things that they don't need. Maybe they don't need, 5 extended family visitors on day 1 of being home that they don't really want to see yet. So I'm helping them to realize what it is they're going to need, figuring out, getting creative with their supports. So maybe they have parents around, that's great, but you don't want, the new grandparents to get burned out either. So can a neighbor make sure your trash is pulled out? Do you know somebody else that could walk the dog? Simple things, easy things, so that a bunch of people are pitching in. But you kind of have to get creative with that because our culture is not used to helping with that, right? Things like meal train, we'll talk about how to set up meal trains so people can offer to bring certain foods by. I encourage them to ask for gift certificates for their favorite restaurants in place of, a bunch of baby gear they may not need, things like that. And then the really nice thing that I've been seeing lately with my current client is the things that I'm modeling and the support that I'm giving, I'm watching the mother's mom and the mother's husband kind of follow in my footsteps a little bit. So I've kind of modeled and shown what type of support has been helpful, and it's easier for them to give that once they've seen it work.
Excellent. So, as you talk about this and the need for, or the benefit of having the communal support, I think about the book Tribe by Sebastian Younger and how so many aspects of our lives are, I'll say, thin or hollow compared to what they were when we lived in a more communal setting. And so that book specifically talks about welcoming veterans back from war and helping them integrate and giving them a sense of belonging in community and having the community involved in the healing process. And let me ask you before we run out of time altogether here, what's an aspect of your work that we haven't even touched on yet? You'd like to be sure that people know or one of your favorite aspects of the work?
I would say that my favorite aspect really, and this probably goes back to, my social work background and, my background in therapy, and not that as a doula, I'm a therapist, but you create relationships with people in this work. That's the whole point. I'm in their home on a regular basis, supporting them through life transitions where, they often don't have all their clothing on, through birth and postpartum and all, it's a very vulnerable setting. And I really enjoy knowing that I've filled the role, that I am, in a sense, a neutral person that's there and can kind of witness objectively some things that might be starting to snowball. So family members, sometimes it gets cloudy because you have that emotional connection with your family. So they don't always see objectively what you need. And especially like a partner is going through this themselves as well. But I really enjoy being able to kind of problem solve a problem before it gets there. So this may be, I'm noticing, okay, you look really tired. And so I'm asking, how much sleep have you got? How much sleep did you get last night? And maybe, there'll be an issue to problem solve about sleep. And then knowing that the next day they were able to get better sleep and really feeling more emotionally stable. And they were able to access joy better because they weren't exhausted. Whereas if we wouldn't have had that conversation, there's a good chance that you're already so tired, you can't really problem solve these things. And that's when things start to snowball and we have crises in the postpartum, when people aren't eating, aren't sleeping, and generally aren't taking care of themselves. So those are the three things I usually ask when I show up to a visit is, when's the last time you showered? When's the last time you ate and what was it? And when's the last time you slept and for how long? So those are the things that I'm kind of preempting to make sure that things don't snowball. That oftentimes a partner is so tired that they're not, able to problem solve that for the birthing person. And, the new grandparents are figuring out their role too. And, sometimes there's weird boundary things between parents and children. So coming in as a neutral person and being able to objectively look at those things and help us to avoid greater issues.
Well, and you just hit it there, avoiding those greater issues, because as you're trying to recover, heal, integrate, build these new roles, all of those things take energy. And if you're trying to heal and you don't have the energy for the healing, and you're trying to learn the role of caretaker for your child and or your spouse, and you don't have proper sleep or proper nutrition, then it just does, that's a real good term for it, it snowballs rather quickly.
For sure.
So are there, if people are looking for a doula, are there keywords to search for, groups to have, to look for? I want somebody who's certified with this group or that group. What kind of training, certification, or guidelines can you give people if they're trying to look for a doula in their area?
Sure. So doulas are a profession that isn't licensed at the moment. And you can get a certificate of completion from your training, but there's no actual certification either at the moment, depending on what state you're in. There are a couple states that have started to look at licensing to allow for the doula services to be covered under insurance and Medicaid and things like that. But most states don't have any of that yet. Most people that are looking for a doula are on social media. So I do like to encourage people to search hashtags, doula or postpartum doula that's a nice way to get to know people through social media a little bit versus just Googling and finding a list and calling someone. You can kind of get to know somebody through their social media and figure out if what their interests are going to be what's going to support you. Also, you can definitely Google and look for people, but oftentimes if you birthing in a hospital, they will have what's called Meet the Midwives and Meet the Doulas. So if you attend one of those presentations, that's how I met my first birth doula. Was I attended Meet the Midwives and Meet the Doulas presentation. And really they put that on so that you can, get to know all of the midwives within an hour, versus seeing them over your pregnancy. But yeah, that's how I met my doula. And so that's always a great thing if you're birthing in a hospital. If you're using a home birth midwife, I'm sure they have doulas that they love to work with. So you could definitely ask for recommendations from them as well. There are, bodies that give certificates. DONA, DONA is a big one in our area, but there are so many options out there. So I wouldn't say that it has to be a DONA certified doula. I think there's lots of great doulas out there that aren't DONA. That just seems to be the biggest one in our area. But yeah, I think it's important to make sure you're not just picking somebody randomly. I definitely think it's important to get to know that person a little bit. And that's why I offer a 30-minute consult to get to know each other so that if these services would even be valuable to you. Word of mouth is really good too. So if you know somebody that's used a doula, then that is a really good way to figure out if they recommend that person as well.
Well, and the other thing that I have found is so important with, especially in the last few years with different patients I'm working with, is I need to give them permission to match the personality
Yes.
of the provider, not just say, well, this person comes recommended by the midwife.
Totally.
Because it's just like if I go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting, the plan's a really good solid plan, the 12-step programs, etc. But every meeting is so different because it's this chemistry of personalities. And from one meeting to the next, if two people are there that weren't there the last time, or one key person is missing, the whole flavor of the meeting is different. And I may not be comfortable with it. Well,
Yeah.
I've had people who go and they have somebody who is recommended to them as a doula or a midwife, and it looks just great on paper. And in the first meeting or two, they realize this is not a good mix chemistry wise. And then they feel compelled to follow through because their OB-GYN person recommended the midwife, or their midwife recommended the doula. So I just encourage people to look for it. It's not about any good provider will not take it personally.
Correct.
If you decide it's just not a good personality mix, a chemistry that we call it.
And, any good doula should be turning you away if it doesn't fit for them as well. It's a two-way street on that as well. So if I know that, so for instance, I'm a white doula, and if someone who was Black decided to contact me about my services, I would let them know that the research really supports that a Black provider would support them better and bring them better outcomes. Not that I'm not willing to do it, but maybe make sure that there isn't a Black provider that they jive with, out there first, because we know that in the maternity world, racism is a huge issue related to outcomes. And the biggest thing that affects that is to prepare Black birthing people up with Black providers. So that is an example of where I might say, I be willing to talk about this for sure, but maybe we need to see if there is another provider that would fit those needs better. Or it could be another example. Maybe somebody doesn't plan to breastfeed, and I know a lot about that. So maybe there's a provider out there that knows a lot more about bottle feeding, for instance. So, and that is where the social media aspect comes in. You can get to know somebody if they're showing up on social media. You can kind of get to know what people specialize in through that you wouldn't necessarily get just on Google,
All right, excellent. Well, so people can get a hold of you through Bonnie M. Griffin, is it .com?
Yep.
And
from the media, and you can find my email from there.
Okay. How do they contact you on social media?
If you go to bonniemgriffin.com, there'll be links for all my social media and for my email on there as well. And if you go to the resources page, I do have some freebies on there as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us. It's a delight to learn more about what you do. And if you branch out into a new area, start a new program, or write a book, please let us know, and we'll have another session.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care. Bonnie M. Griffin is a postpartum doula who specializes in preparing her clients for their postpartum experience while they are still pregnant. Her individualized postpartum support is informed by her background and knowledge in social work, in herbalism, in breastfeeding, and in baby wearing. Bonnie has 2 children and enjoys reading, being in nature, and doing yoga. Bonnie's website is bonniemgriffin.com.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.